next speaker is Elizabeth Grimshaw from the University of Buckingham. Let's give her a couple of minutes. Right, so Elizabeth Grimshaw is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Buckingham. Her research on Dickens, the Magic London theatre in the 19th century, has been presented in London and Manchester, and recently shared at the Dickens Symposium in Rochester, New York. Her Master of Arts is from the University of Kent, Canterbury, and her undergraduate studies in art history and literature were undertaken at Carleton University, Ottawa, Canada, and the University of East Anglia in Norwich. So, whenever you're ready, Elizabeth, thank you very much.
Testing. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so very much for having me. And I'm about to talk at length about this gentleman, Charles Dickens. Thank you for having me. I wanted to start with a dramatic moment that happened to a woman on stage in the 19th century, unfortunately told from the perspective of two men. On the evening of April 26, 1838, Charles Dickens wrote a hurried note from inside a cab addressed to Thomas Newton Telford, who was a man of many talents. Not only was Telford a barrister, judge, and member of Parliament who fought for copyright protection for authors, he was also the author himself of multiple plays, including Ion, or the Founding of Argos, and the Athenian Captive, which was at this time in rehearsals for forthcoming performances at Covent Garden. Dickens writes in his hurried note, "My dear Telford, Mrs. Warner is suddenly taken ill and cannot play in your tragedy." This euphemistic reference to illness meant that Mary Amelia Warner, who was born Huddart, had entered premature labor. The most esteemed Shakespearean actor of his day, William Macready, recorded in his diary the following. Wilmot called in with a note from Mr. Warner, informing Bartley, the stage manager at Covent Garden, of Mrs. Warner's sudden indisposition, her labor having come upon her unexpectedly. Mrs. Clifford had Volumnia sent to her, and we talked over the business of the ensuing week, deciding on closing the theater Saturday night. Mrs. Warner had been billed to play Volumnia, so when Macready heard the news, he called on Mrs. Clifford, due to play Valeria, to take up the part, and they mutually agreed to postpone the performance, which was eventually resumed after she had her healthy child on August the 4th. Dickens's close friend and later biographer John Forster was in the cab that night as well, and Macready describes him coming in a great fuss about the postponement of the Athenian Captive and busying himself very much, setting off to find Telford and apprise him of the disappointment. Forster and Dickens wrote to Telford, "The only possible way to prevent postponement is for you to see Miss Fawcett tonight and ask her to play the part. Forster and I have thought it our duty to you to come from the theater immediately on hearing the news and acquaint you with it. We will wait in a cab at the corner of Lord Lansdowne's garden wall for 10 minutes if you think it necessary to come to us. Ever yours, Charles Dickens." P.S. If you cannot come to us now, which I should recommend, we shall be in letter C7 at the theater. Macready the next day reflected on this in his diary. He said he acted Coriolanus pretty well. And then he said, Telford, Dickens, and Forster came to my home and debated what was to be done. Telford had come from Lord Lansdowne's dinner party and went up with Forster to see Miss H. Fawcett to ask her to play the part. She entertained the subject but could give no answer till the morrow. The next day, Macready was shocked when Mrs. Telford, who has had her two parts in the play taken away from her, sent a note to these men declining Miss Fawcett's taking her performance in a less courteous strain than I would write to any servant or poor tradesperson. Unfortunately, we do not have this note, but we can only imagine the anger of a woman who has had two starring roles at Covent Garden taken away from her immediately postpartum. We can only imagine what she might have to say about that. I think there was probably some strong language in there. Why did Dickens, Forster, Telford, and Macready as a group believe that they could direct the actions of this woman from backstage, from beside her on stage, or indeed even from their position in box C in the audience? Dickens had been deeply involved in the world of the 19th century theater for a long time, but this particular dramatic moment and Mrs. Warner's lost response are one of the highlights of my timeline of all Dickens's engagement with visual entertainments throughout his biography. So as part of my PhD, one of the things I'm creating is a timeline of every time that Dickens went to the theater. There's a lot. So I'm interested in Dickens and theater technologies and also theater practitioners who don't get enough credit, including these lovely women here. I wanted in this talk to highlight both how intertwined Dickens and theater are, and also to try to find hopeful notes of female figures pushing back out from under the eclipse of his control and challenging him from his position as stage director of their fictional and factual lives. So just a little bit about Dickens. Dickens was born in 1812, and by 1820 he was already an author, but not of a novel. He wrote a tragic play entitled Miznar, the Sultan of India, which was largely inspired by the tales of the genie in the Arabian Nights. Sadly for us, again, no copies or reviews of this juvenilia have been passed down to posterity. He was only 9 when he wrote it. The earliest possibility of Dickens' known writing surviving is again in the form of a drama called The Stratagems of Rosanna, a Venetian comedetta. In his 20s, Dickens wrote that he attended the theater every night for at least 3 years, which is why there's so much research to be done on what he saw in the theater. He became very immersed and impressed with the star actors and actresses of his day. In 1831, Dickens wrote to George Bartley, who we've already seen as messenger in that first scene, to deliver the news of Mrs. Warner's labor. Bartley was manager of Covent Garden Theatre, and Dickens asked him for an audition. Dickens told Bartley that he possessed a strong perception of character and oddity and a natural power of reproducing in my own person what I observe in others. He planned to perform a type of monologue called a monologue in the style of Charles Matthews, an actor known for playing dozens of parts in the course of a 10-minute long sketch. When March 1832 came around, the 20-year-old aspiring theater practitioner and actor Charles Dickens was unfortunately too ill to attend his audition, which ended his career as a playwright and performer before it really began. What happened to all of his youthful, energetic interest in the stage? It never completely went away and appears very frequently on the page through private theatricals and in his later dramatic readings. The earliest surviving manuscript of which we are certain is Dickens is Othello with a capital O apostrophe, which is an Irish parody of Othello. Dickens wrote this adaptation in 1832 or 1833, having his father star in the role of the Great Unpaid. His father, John Dickens, later living up to his name, sold his copy of the script. So we have him and his dwindling financial resources to thank for the script's survival. Yes, thank you, John. The Dickens family performed Dickens' parody in 1833, just after Dickens sadly missed his Covent Garden audition. So we can see here that his interest has moved from the theater as a professional space into a space of domestic performance and the private theatrical. While Dickens was writing the Pickwick Papers, he composed the libretto for The Village Coquettes, an opera by John Hulla that was staged in 1836. The following year, when he was writing Oliver Twist, he wrote a farce for the St. James Theatre called Is She His Wife? Simon Callow, who's a 21st century actor, suggests that by 1838, Dickens had largely sublimated his theatrical imagination into his novels. That year, he was writing Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby simultaneously, releasing each month an installment of each. Dickens depicts performers and the audience as performers throughout his sketches by Boz. In Making a Night of It, we can see a typical scene from a London theater. Two gentlemen, and I'm using the word gentleman sort of incorrectly here, they start out on their expedition to manufacture a night. It was just 8:30, so they thought they couldn't do better than go half price to the slips at the City Theater. One of the gentlemen subsequently embellished the theater by falling asleep with his head and both arms gracefully drooping over the front of the boxes. The overture concluded, the second piece began, and Mr. Thomas Parter, one of our gentlemen, emboldened by impunity, proceeded to behave in a most unprecedented and outrageous manner. First of all, he imitated the shake of the principal female singer. Then he groaned at the blue fire, then affected to be frightened into convulsions of terror at the appearance of the ghost, and lastly, not only made a running commentary in an audible voice upon the dialogue upon the stage, but actually awoke his friend, Mr. Robert. At this point, a general cry of "turn them out" goes up, and the men are dragged out, and we are given a vivid vision of just how interactive and interruptive a 19th century audience might be. You might have a slightly different class of audience at a private theater. In 1836, Dickens wrote Private Theatricals, which opens with the pricing of the following roles: Richard III, the Duke of Gloucester, Earl of Richmond, and the Duke of Buckingham. Such are the written placards wafered up in the gentleman's dressing room, or the green room, where there is any, at a private theater, and such are the sums extracted from the shop till, or overcharged in the office expenditure, by the donkeys who are prevailed upon to pay for permission to exhibit their lamentable ignorance. So you can see he doesn't think very highly of private theatricals at this time. Dickens describes to these donkeys how to best get your money's worth out of your role. The tent scene is confessedly worth half a sovereign, and so you have the fight in gratis, and everybody knows when an effect may be produced by a good combat. You want to go under, then thrust, then dodge and slide about, then fall down on one knee, then fight upon one knee, and then get up again and stagger. You may keep on doing this as long as it seems to take with the audience, let's say 10 minutes, and then fall down backwards if you can manage it without hurting yourself, and die. Nothing like it for producing an effect. They always do it at Astley's and Sadler Wells, and if they don't know how to do this sort of thing, who in the world does? Dickens describes the typical patron of a private theater as a dirty boy or a low copying clerk, a class to which Dickens unfortunately himself belonged, perhaps both classes. And he says of the lady performers, they pay nothing for their characters, which is a sort of arch reference. But when Dickens wanted to mount his own private theatricals, he went to a playhouse and to a woman of a very different order. Enter Miss Kelly. Miss Kelly's theater opened on the 26th of May, 1840, as Miss Kelly's Theater and Dramatic School, designed by the architect Samuel Beasley. You can see it's a lovely space, a little more elegant than the last one we saw in the drawing by Cruikshank. The famous Drury Lane actress Fanny Kelly had had the theater built in her own backyard and that of her adjoining neighbor. Dickens first mentions her in a letter of August 7th, 1845, to a friend confiding, "Mayhap you may have heard that some friends of yours are going to have a private play at Miss Kelly's theater. How that Clarkson Stanfield is not innocent of the fact, how that John Forster Esquire has been spoken of for Kitely, and how that Charles Dickens Esquire is connected in whispers with Bombadil." So that's who he's depicting in this portrait. And of course, the woman's name is unknown, which I think is a bit evocative. On August 8th, Dickens reported, "I went to see Miss Kelly in her theater. I became a convert immediately. The stage is much wider than I had supposed. The audience part very good, and the whole perfectly genteel and private, and the space sufficient for our actors, or the devils in it. We therefore decide, on my stage managerial recommendation, to play there." Dickens wrote to his friend Angela Burdett Coutts, Baroness, banker, and philanthropist, "I am stage manager of a company of amateurs who are going to have a play at Miss Kelly's theater. The comedy is called Every Man in His Humor. There will be one man very much out of humor if you are not in town." Dickens and his amateurs were practicing on the 16th of September, in dress rehearsals on the 18th, practicing again a last time on the 19th, and they premiered their work at Miss Kelly's on the 20th. It was such a roaring success that they rehearsed again at Miss Kelly's theater on the 5th, 10th, 11th, and 12th of November, to act again on the 15th of November. This final performance was a command one for Prince Albert, as a benefit for Dr. Southwood Smith's sanatorium. He again returned to her theater in 1847 to prepare his presentation of The Merry Wives of Windsor. He returned in 1848 for Animal Magnetism, and he wrote on the 22nd of June, 1848, "I shall be at Miss Kelly's tomorrow evening from 7 to 8, and shall hope to see you there for a little conversation touching the arrangements. P.S. I am fully persuaded that an amateur manager has more correspondence than a home secretary." In July, he described in a playbill his successful production at Miss Kelly's Temple of Mirth, 73 Dean Street. This royal connection of Prince Albert's patronage and the continued relationship between Dickens and Miss Kelly over years and years in a professional capacity shows a woman excellently managing a group of men on the London stage as sort of the inverse of that first event where he's managing a woman who makes her living on stage. The final story I want to share is of a woman in complete control of a Dickens production, the first woman I know of to do so. Mrs. Alfred Mellon, who was first Miss Wolgar, has beautiful portraits in the Fox Talbot Museum of Wiltshire and the Victoria and Albert Museum. They describe her as an actress only. Her husband, Alfred Mellon, had married her in 1855, and they had 2 daughters, one of whom, Mary, went on the stage herself. Alfred was director of music at the Haymarket and Adelphi theaters at the time of their marriage. Mrs. Mellon was described as a versatile actress who could play comedy and tragedy both. She first appeared on the stage at Plymouth in 1836. Over her long career, she performed at the Adelphi, remaining there for several years, most notably originating the part of Lemuel in Buckstone's Flowers of the Forest. She went on to play Florizel in Perdita, Ophelia in Hamlet, Catherine Duval in The Dead Heart, and Mrs. Cratchit in A Christmas Carol in 1860, which of course is one of Dickens's famous works. This Dickensian connection is not her last, as we have this tantalizing playbill from the New York Public Library, indicating that in 1868, 8 years later, she directed a production of the Dickens and Wilkie Collins play No Thoroughfare. Women were proving they could manage the stage and the actors upon it, as well as their own lives. I wanted to close by returning to Miss Warner, who we left with a babe in arms and that hurried note from the cab. She had joined Macready early in her career at Covent Garden Theatre, where she stayed for 2 years, supporting him in many Shakespearean parts and building her reputation, which is described as second in her lifetime only to Mrs. Charles Keene and Helen Fawcett. She was the original Joan of Arc in Thomas James Searle's play of that name. She played the Queen in Hamlet, the original Lady Lydia Lintern in The Patrician's Daughter. In 1843, she acted with Samuel Phelps in Bath, and in 1844, with he in Greenwood, began management of Sadler's Wells Theatre, opening that season as Lady Macbeth. Warner then took on the management of the Marylebone Theatre. She played parts there such as Julia in The Hunchback by Knowles, Lady Teazle, and Lady Townley in The Provoked Husband. Warner supported Macready throughout his farewell performances in 1851. Sadler's Wells was opened for a few nights specifically before the beginning of the regular season to give her an opportunity of playing a melange of her best-known characters before she started for her American tour. What proved to be her last appearance in England was made in August as Mrs. Oakley in The Jealous Wife. She met with great success in her American tour. She died on September 24th, 1854, at 16 Euston Place, Euston Square, and was buried on the western side of Highgate Cemetery in a grave which no longer has a readable inscription. While the majority of my PhD project currently is focused on recovering the use of the technologies of the theater and their place in art history, I think this framework has helped direct my attention to some women who Dickens attempted to direct, but who skillfully pushed back and acted as sites of resistance on stage. If we pull back the curtain and direct our attention towards these women, it doesn't diminish the career of Dickens or others in the canon, but instead adds a dramatic depth and richness that I look to continue to see unfold across this conference. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Perfect timing, by the way. So let's have some time for questions, comments. Is there any questions or comments? With that, yes. Sorry, we have a microphone. Oh, thank you.
Wonderful.
So it's a question for Dr. Boulan-Puyal, which is, do we know anything about productions of The Bride, which you said was written in 1828, published in 1828? Did it ever make the stage? Did any actresses at the time that Elizabeth's been talking about take either of the
I haven't found any records of it being. It's true I haven't been able to do a lot of archival research, but for what I found from her own papers or references by other scholars, it was basically translated, so it was read but not staged, as far as I know. Even for in Britain, for what you can read from the preface, she was considering more it was going to be read than staged. That she wanted people to read it and then maybe buy more copies, so then more translations could be made. And she's talking about a trend of translations that are flowing in Ceylon of other works, and she wants to contribute consciously to that, not have a popular play then translated into Sinhalese, but actually write it with the idea of it being translated. And I think that makes this production probably tricky to produce, just the scenery it describes and everything else. When I read it, I got the feeling it was more for just a closet reading than production. But I as far as I know, there haven't been. But as I said, maybe we'll find record of that.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to elaborate on that. So, if the plays were not to be staged, they were supposed to be read, right? Do you have an idea sort of what type of target reader she addressed the writing for?
Well, this concept of the closet drama or the red drama, I think I get the feeling that she doesn't reduce her readers. I don't know, Kate is nodding, maybe she knows more than me, but it's I get the feeling always with Bailey that she's not writing for women or men or younger. She doesn't limit her audience, I would say. It's true that these kind of pieces, for what we read of, were read by women, and probably they were considered much more proper than allowing your daughter to go to the theatre. But I don't think she ever limits herself. I think she's very ambitious, and she doesn't want to limit herself, and she considers herself, she plays modest. I'm reading now Witchcraft because I thought, oh, The Bride, Witchcraft, let's look at two very different types of women in her production. And she starts by saying, oh, I told Walter Scott, you should be the one writing this because it was inspired, by a line in your work. And Scott didn't feel up to it. And she was like, oh, it's a loss for everybody, but I'm going to do it. And you feel that she's playing modest, but she's really saying, I'm probably the better one to write this. And even Scott himself said, you're better at writing dramas than I am. So she's not overly modest, I would say, or she plays into that. But I think she writes for a wide variety of readers, even in her preface when she says about how important it is to have this work, how this work can have a huge impact on society, both in Ceylon and British society, how she is adding to the work of missionaries going there and people who come back to Britain and are trying to bring this message back home, and she inscribes herself into that very, very important mission. So I think she wouldn't limit herself to a very specific kind of reader, or as we tend to think, young women reading in isolation at home.
Ariel?
Fantastic progress. I was just thinking, listening to you both about Elizabeth, for instance, development having topic of a starting point and then about reading, and realistic views of of Dickens. I was not acquainted with that during the list of names. My apologies, and perhaps my questions as well. I was thinking about the duration of the risk stages, or these risk spheres and developments of stages. Essentially, the statue comes
Always tell your students, don't say I don't know. Just say that's an interesting question. I'll look it up. But honestly, I don't know. But I would get to write it down and look it up. Thank you. That's a very interesting question. So.
Do we have more comments? I think we have one over there.
Thank you. So I'm interested in the notion of a woman who is, at least to some extent, heavily and presumably visibly pregnant. I mean, if it's premature labor, but she delivers a healthy child, in the role of Volumnia, in something that is clearly a Coriolanus redux, and what that does, it's something sort of, I guess, tag teaming off of the notion of a Pygmalion-like experience. What it does to have that physicality intrude into the theater of the time. It's not something I've done any looking at. Are there other moments where you come across Dickens sort of dealing with the, I guess, inescapable physicality of a woman's body in this way, and sort of setting it to one side on some level?
Thank you so much for this question. So I think Dickens has been rightly and roundly criticized for his depictions of women, as he should. So this is one of the few cases I know of where he speaks about the physicality of pregnancy, but even then he cannot bring himself to say she is pregnant, she is with child, she is giving birth backstage, and that's why my friend and I are here in this cab we paid for, losing our minds running around town. He has to say she is ill, and it's Macready who records she went into premature labor in his own diary. So there's something about this public-private where, because Macready's recording his own thoughts, his own self-reflections on his own performance, of acting Coriolanus middlingly, oh yeah, a woman gave birth backstage, just a normal day for me, but there's something about that space of privacy where maybe that's where men can discuss that physicality. But I think that would be a very difficult evening for her to play two starring roles in two back-to-back plays while 8 to 9 months pregnant is very, very impressive. And I would love to see some records from her point of view of what that might have felt like and the pressures that that would have put upon a performer.
So was that common? Do we have other records of women, you know, being pregnant on stage? Sorry, from my absolute not really knowing if that's common, and then did they hide it? Did they just write it in, or is this a one instance occasion, or do we know of other women who had to go through that and work until the very moment of labor and then face this? And
I think in a world without paid maternity leave, we're all working right up until the last moment, right? We're working
paid that much. Yes.
You know, plus ça change. So Mrs. Alfred Mellon is married in 1855 and then has her daughter Mary in 1856. And this is while she's actively performing on stage. So I'm not sure how you might modify a flowing Grecian robe to hide such a thing with corsetry, or if you're depending on the goodwill of the audience to go along with an older woman who's a married woman playing the young virgin who's the Vestal Virgin or something like this, right? So unfortunately we don't have a lot of records that are from that woman's perspective, right? If this is the costuming that I put on, and then the images we do have of them are not them in performance, but how they'd like to look as a sort of private woman with the chatelaine, the sort of symbol of domesticity there.
Yeah, I was thinking in particular about the practical details. If we had records of, how how I managed to do this, how I felt, how the audience reacted to, yes, I have a virgin, a Vestal, 9 months pregnant.
Yeah.
Did we write it in as adding to the humor or not?
It seemed it was a quite rowdy place. I really like that detail of the second gentleman yelling so much it wakes up his sleeping friend. It was a very interactive place with a lot of heckling. So I think there may have been comments directed at the women, which may not be recorded for sort of propriety reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more comments? I think that we have time for one more. Right, I do have a comment, and I hope that it's not too unrelated to your topic, Elizabeth, because the other day I was reading about the act of naming a theatre with your own name, which was done by Laura King, mainly in the US. So it caught my attention that you mentioned Miss Kelly's theatre, and I was wondering if you have more information about that theatre, or if you are going into that, not to put you in an uncomfortable position. But if you have, it would be really interesting to see how that influences the choice of the repertoire that they were performing there, maybe the type of characters.
So I do know that Miss Kelly turned down a marriage proposal the year before she opened this theater. So I think the emphasis is on the Miss in Miss Kelly. And you can see that we've got a much higher quality of space. We've got a very different tone than in this first theater. And I think that was crucial to her. But that's something I definitely want to learn more about, is how did she change this setting into one of propriety and excellence, such to the point that Prince Albert was able to attend a fundraiser there? Because I don't think Prince Albert would be with those two drunken hooligans as much. Maybe, but maybe not so much.
It will give a great anecdote for her, to promote the theatre. Well, thank you to both of you. Oh yeah, we have one comment. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to edit something concerning the topic pregnant actresses. I know 2 cases for the German-speaking theater in Germany. The researcher Melanie Himmelkruis does research on pregnant actresses. For example, Goethe was directing and staging pregnant actresses, and they played a virgin, for example, and then weeks later they gave birth, and 1 week later she was already back on stage. And I know another case I will introduce to you, Josephine Dallmayr, later, and her mother gave birth, and then I think 1 or 2 weeks later, she's already in another place, and she left her baby back. So it was quite common to do business as usual and go back on stage as soon as possible, I guess.
Thank you. I just found it very interesting. I was reading some self-narratives from 18th century actresses, and they don't really focus on that. We know they had children and we know they continued working, but well, obviously pregnancy, everything related to women's body was kind of hush-hush. But just that they didn't even record, because this was going to be published and read by a wide audience, and how they decided to skip all that altogether, the labor, just having to go back to work so early. So that's why I thought, it would be so wonderful to have their own thoughts about what it was like. And because, well, as we said, we know what it is, and it would be interesting to get those testimonies. So thank you for that.
Yes, we have one more question.
Okay. Well, just in response to what you just said about, you know, it not being documented. I mean, I worked as a freelance performer until I took up my academic post, and I worked through both pregnancies right up to the last minute, and I was touring again after 5 weeks. And I think the reason you don't mention it is that you won't get work. So I think the example of Dickens, you know, vetoing, making a decision for you, women have to be very quiet about their pregnancies and very covert about what's going on, and people can see it. And the women go for an audition for a huge tour of a year. They saw that I was pregnant, and that was why I didn't get work, because already at that stage I was about 6 months pregnant. So when you're freelance, and your income totally depends on your ability to carry on working, and you don't get adequate maternity benefit when you're freelance, you just have to keep going, and that's happening even now. I also worked at the Globe, and was asked to do an all-female production of Taming of the Shrew, and at that point I was 8 months pregnant. And we said, it doesn't matter, you know, we have loads of actresses. You know, they can look up to their pregnancy, and that was in sort of full Elizabethan costume, you know, with the sun shining on you. But you just do it. So I think that's why we don't document it, because if you make a fuss about it, you don't get asked to work.